So welcome everybody here in the room. There are a few people here and I'm reliably informed there are 16 of you somewhere out there in the world. I'm Steve Dovers and I'll chair today, and in welcoming everyone here, I on all of our behalf also acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we're standing on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their culture and to their elders past, present and emerging, and sovereignty has never been ceded. It's my pleasure, or it has been my pleasure for a small number of years to have chaired Nadeem and Jim's PhD endeavours. And they bring today to us in an unusual double header. We usually just have one presentation, but because of various reasons of cognate topics and other things, to have both together, not just their PhD work, but many decades of experience. And to me, they're known as number 65 and 66 of the 70 completions I'm hoping to reach by the end of the year of PhD students. And it's called an exit seminar, but I think it's really an almost there seminar for both Nadeem and Jim. And what we'll do today, I think to both of them when they decided to do a PhD, say that a sports car and a leather jacket was both less expensive and probably more pleasurable midlife crisis, but they battled on and are both getting to that final stretch. At Nadeem and Jim's request, we'll have about 30-minute presentations from both, followed by really necessary clarifying questions, and then much more open it up to a discussion which we will try and run both virtually and here in the room. So hopefully that will go. So do jot down, we want this to be as much of a discussion as at the end as just question and answer. And we, particularly Pete in the corner there, will make sure that the technology works perfectly. And to open proceedings, Nadeem Samnakay with design and implementation criteria for evaluating good practice sustainability policy making.
Thanks to you. I think we're on. I don't need to do anything here apart from up and down. Yeah, look, thank you everyone for coming. We've got a good renter crowd just coming in. So hello to everyone I know. There's a few people here that I don't know. Yeah, so as Steve said, I actually started this topic about 2011. And that's when I first signed on. Now that has not shown. Where's that? Where's the IT man? I've just gone down one and it hasn't changed on the screen. Just bear with me if you're online. Can people online see that?
So there should be.
Oh, I should be on there.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah, so just use the arrows across.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm gonna start with my acknowledgements. I think most people finish with one, and so yeah, I'm not going to go through everyone. There's lots of people who've helped me in this journey. So many of you in the room actually, but Steve and Neil have been with me right from the start. I managed not to scare them off, and we're almost at the end of the journey. But thanks very much to Steve and Neil. I did have Karen Hussey on my supervisory panel, but we had an amicable split. The Jaded Diamonds, some of them are here, but particular mention to Jim Donaldson, because we've sort of lived parallel lives work-wise, professionally, but also doing PhD together. And it's really just coincidence, ironic that we're ending up giving our seminars together. It was never planned back in 2013 when I enrolled that we would give our seminars together. And a whole heap of other people have helped me get to this journey as well. Now I've got something like 27 slides and I'm not going to get through all of them. It's not changing on my screen for some reason, but I'm happy to look at that and talk about that if that helps. So yeah, my topic, what constitutes good practice sustainability policy making? It would be nice if I can have it on here. I don't know if that'll save me looking around. Anyway, while that's happening, I think for the last however many, that's better, yeah. For the last however many years, I've been troubling over what my methodology and my theory is. And I'm going to go with Steve, which basically sort of, oh, sorry, I came off the camera. I'm going to go with Steve sort of saying it's public policy evaluation theory. And partly the reason for being vague is because the literature is quite vague on what policy analysis is and what policy is. So there's a number of things I've looked at: policy design, policy implementation, policy evaluation. And I've used the policy cycle as my analytical heuristic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, it's a thesis by compilation. I've got 4 papers, 2 are published, 1 under review now. I was hoping I could have given you an update, and the 4th in some level of completeness, which was really just looking at drought policy. So now paper number 3 is an analytical framework, which I've done, which I've developed, and then paper 4 was testing it. I'm going to go through all the papers, but really quickly, because it's really the discussion I think we're trying to get. So I looked at what I mean by strategy. So I've looked at a number of strategies. My first paper looked at 4 sort of overarching documents. They might be called frameworks, plans, roadmaps, white papers. So my first paper is just sort of saying, what are strategies? How does government do them? So I'm not particularly in the environment sustainability sector. Papers 2 and 3 sort of build on drilling into National Water Initiative, National Forest Policy Statements / RFAs, and land care. So I've looked at how did those 3 things come about? How have they been implemented? They've had a good history of implementation over the last 10, some 20 years for RFAs, for example. Paper 4 looked at the National Drought Agreement, and I've sort of skimmed through others like biodiversity, marine fisheries. I haven't looked at climate change, and I don't even know if there is a climate change strategy, but if there is one or has been one, let me know of it. And what I'll try and do towards the end is, if you've had experience in any one or more of these, I'll take you through some of my framework, and I'll get you to score your pet strategy against my framework, and we'll see what we come up with if it works. Now, this picture I took at University of Canberra. It pretty much summarizes my thesis in many ways. Ecologically sustainable development, you know, had this utopia, sense of utopia about it. When I started my career some 30-ish years ago, ESD was the big thing, and it sort of gave a sense that you could have your cake and eat it too. You know, there was a nirvana, a utopia sense about it. And well, I guess my own personal view is I don't think we've got there. But if you look at that picture, you know, it'll sound a little bit flippant, but I'm really trying to stress some points here. The pot plant strategy has a relationship to the concrete, and the concrete has a relationship to some ants there, and the pot plant has a relationship to the grass. Now, ESD is sort of saying all those things are important in terms of sustainability outcomes, but we've defaulted to sectoral strategies. So we have a pot plant strategy, and we have a lawn strategy, and we have a concrete strategy, and we have an ant strategy. So we've gone sectoral, and basically I'm sort of saying, okay, that's what we're given. How can we get the best out of these strategies, given that's how we're going? Now, if you look at that, you know, I think if we focus on the pot plant strategy, the objective is wonderful, isn't it? Grow, grow, grow. That's a wonderful objective, but some of the things I've looked at in my thesis is, what should the objective of a strategy be? Now, these strategies are all in the framing, so national strategies, the Commonwealth government doesn't have many powers to actually implement things on the ground. It needs to do things with states and territories. The more general, the more loose the objective or the objectives of a strategy, the more agreeable they are. So if the strategy is grow a pot plant, it's likely the states would sign on to that. That's quite good. It's broad enough that you can drive a truck through. problem comes when you want to then evaluate how well that strategy has performed, because what you might be growing is a weed, but the strategy might be saying, look, grow a native plant of a certain species or variety. The other thing is you don't want a strategy that says grow an acacia something or rather 5 meters high, and must be 2 meters wide, etc., because that's quite specific, much harder to get states to sign on to something that's prescriptive. So there's these strategies tend to be high-level principles-based. I'll come back to that because I've got some examples of what I consider good and bad objectives. I'm just going to go back a little bit because there was a diagram which I don't know if it'll show up. Maybe I skipped it. Oh, sorry, my apologies. So what are strategic attributes? My first paper really sort of covers off on these things. They're principles-based. It makes it easy to agree with. That pertain to wicked problems. As a result, you need systemic approaches to problem resolution, even though they're intractable mostly. Decadal timeframes for policy intervention. You need intersectoral approaches, even though there's sectoral strategies. And there's a hierarchy of say, the image I was after, obviously I've taken it out, but to implement these things, there's subordinate policies, programs, and plans at the lower level where the rubber really hits the road. But I'm looking at the sort of upper end of the hierarchy where there's the principles-based. They're generally applicable. The higher up you move in the hierarchy, the more economy-wide that the strategy has an influence. Whereas if you come down to policies, plans, they're really influencing some subsector of the environment, for example. Probably a classic example is environmental watering strategy, for example. It's quite specific. It's about how we manage water in rivers. They do require partnerships with state and territories. It's a sort of central focus of my research. How does the Commonwealth work on these things where it has limited constitutional powers? And there's generally some level of industry reform. And that's why the reason I'm calling these strategies sustainability policies and not environment policies is because they generally have some level of economic, environmental outcomes that they're trying to get. So they're not purely environmental. There'll be some adjustment required in production to try and give effect to the environmental outcome, as opposed to something that might be, say, a purely environmental policy, say, for example, the Indigenous Rangers program. So I hope that makes sense about how I'm classifying these as sustainability strategies. So there's an element about them, most of them stated, they're either trying to optimize social, economic, environmental, or get a balance between social, economic, environmental outcomes. And maybe Jim might talk a bit about that. Now, a lot of detail there. I'm going to really brush through this because we can come back to it in discussion, but I just wanted to give you a sense that I've looked at a whole heap of elements in policy process, and it's policy processes that's the focus of my PhD. So, how can we measure success in terms of good process? So I'm not talking about good outcomes. Are we getting the environmental outcomes that we get? But in some ways, the underlying thesis, underlying assumption of my research is saying, if you have good process, you're more likely to get good outcome. Now, that's not a guarantee. There's a whole heap of reasons why you can have good process but not have good environmental outcomes. But I think if you've got bad process, if you're just going to wing it and expect some environmental magic to happen, it's a supposition that I think that that's less likely. Now, I've used the policy cycle, and there's lots of different policy cycles. Howlett, Ramesh, Perl. So I've used that in my second paper, and Althaus, Bridgman, Davis in my third paper. The Althaus policy cycle just allows me to disaggregate the way I analyze these strategies a bit more. There's just, you know, six subsets or 6 stages as opposed to 5. Some of you may also be aware that the policy cycle has had some criticism as a heuristic. That the criticism, and you know, sort of published criticism, is that the policy cycle assumes that policy making is rational. And I think in pretty much all my papers, I highlight why good process does not result in good outcome. So, you know, it's certainly not the case that the policy cycle assumes rational policy making. In fact, in this space, there's a lot of irrationality given the complexity of the policy space. And it's a heuristic, it's an analytical heuristic, and I've found it to be really useful for my purposes. We can have a discussion about that if need be, but I wasn't going to go into too much detail other than to say it served my purposes. And there's a diagram I'll show soon that these strategies actually follow a cycle quite well, and I'll come to that. Now, this is my one slide where I say you're not supposed to read the detail, but it's just to show that. So well, if you're looking at the screen, on the left-hand side of the screen are the policy stages. And there's a whole heap of analytical queries that I've developed that allows me to pull out the data, in a sense, around policies. You know, what are the drivers? What processes were used? How were policies designed? So I'm not going to go into the detail. You won't get a sense of that in my talk because it's a helicopter view of 4 papers. And a lot of those analytical questions I've got from these 4 references. The one I'll talk about is Marsh and McConnell's paper on policy success. So they sort of say policy success can be grouped as either outcome success. Did you get the outcome that the policy was saying it would get? You can have a procedural success, or the process was successful. Now that's really where I'm looking at. And the third category they say is political success. And maybe Jim might talk a little bit more about that. I'm not going to touch on politics too much. I think Jim's topic will largely be about politics. And I think that the interesting thing they say is that you can have success in one of those criteria. So you can have political success, for example, but not necessarily have process success or outcome success. And I tend to think it's a good framing, and I've used that throughout my research. I hope that makes sense. This is the schematic I was talking about. So that my research looks at a whole heap of papers, and there's no end of reviews about policies that say how bad these policies have been. I'll touch on 2 or 3 points. One is that the policy is initiated because there's a crisis. Our pot plant's not growing. Commonwealth government comes in, you know, so that's a political decision. Bureaucrats have to work out what that means. Pot plant's not growing. They run through a heap of events. One thing I guess, there's no real consideration of what success looks like. So when you come to the bottom end of that, you know, evaluation, monitoring and evaluation, the evaluation usually sort of says, hey, we're not getting what we wanted. This policy is bad. So after 5 years, we're going to scrap it, or we're going to make some dramatic changes. So while that's good, if you looked at sort of adaptive management, one would say, well, that's what one is supposed to do in adaptive management. But usually these policies or strategies lack that sort of rigor in process to say, what was it that didn't allow the strategy to work? The political decision is, well, that was wrong. That was Labour's policy. We're going to change it, or that was Liberals' policy, we're going to change it. So you get these whole-scale changes in policy which aren't founded upon sort of rational decisions. Right, in addition to that, in addition to those strategies I showed earlier, I've looked at some reviews by Productivity Commission. I looked at a heap of reviews by the National Audit Office. And in total, I sort of analysed about 23 policies, what's good, bad, indifferent around policy processes. And the framework, which is presented in paper 3, has 16 design criteria, 44 implementation criteria. Now, I can't go through all that, but that's in some ways, paper 3 is the pinnacle of my research. But what I will do, that's a quick summary of the framework. Again, I can come back to some of this, or happy to discuss at later dates for more detailed seminars or discussions if anyone's interested. But this, I think, hopefully is the interactive bit, and I'll finish off on these slides. So if you've had experience in, say, National Water Initiative, RFAs, forest policy, whatever, you pick your strategy, and it's not for me to judge whether your strategy is a strategy or not. And see if you can answer these questions, give it a score out of 16. I'll be keen to see who scores high and who scores low against your respective policy. So these are criteria which I'm considering, which I consider, if you picked up a strategy, you would want these 16 criteria to be reflected within a document. So first one, is the case for a national policy broadly accepted? Answer yes, no. You can give half the mark if you think your strategy does cover it. Is the nature of the problem clearly articulated? Was there a comprehensive stakeholder consultation process? Have other portfolio agencies at federal and state levels been actively engaged in policy design? So if you can keep a score of these, I'll be keen to see how you go. Are policy objectives and principles coherent and achievable? Timeframe specified for implementation processes. This is about who, where, why, when type of stuff. Are national coordinating mechanisms clear? Are state federal roles, responsibilities clarified? Are there mechanisms for vertical integration between federal and state responsibilities? Are there mechanisms for horizontal integration across portfolio agencies? Will non-government stakeholders remain engaged in policy implementation and evaluation? So this isn't about consultation, this is throughout the life of the implementation. Is implementation supported by a broad mix of policy tools? Are funding arrangements stipulated? There are many strategies that don't have funding arrangements. I don't know if anyone's picked biodiversity strategy. I suspect that might be one. Are reporting and review requirements clearly stated? Are compliance audit functions stipulated? Are the risks of not addressing the problem identified? So there's 16 criteria in my framework, which I'm suggesting would be good practice if there was, let's say, a new national water initiative or a new forest policy, etc. Now, I've tested these against the drought agreement, national drought agreement, and it doesn't stack up very well, but I'm not going to go into the detail of that. That's something we can come to. I'll skip that. I've given my own scoring ranking against some of these policies. We'd be keen to see. There's some research gaps I can come back to, and that's my paper pipeline. Can I ask a quick question? Did anyone score 14 or better?
So yes is 1 and 0
is no. Yeah. 14 or better? Anyone online got 14 or better? Phil, what was your strategy, please? Offsets. Oh, 10 for RFAs. Okay, that wasn't 14 or better. Okay, all right, 10 or better. Who got 10 or better? What was yours, Stuart?
national security strategy.
Oh, okay. Right. Anyone got 6 or better? Okay, so almost, yeah, okay. At least in the room, who's had experience with one or other strategies? I know a number of you have. Okay, so I think some people aren't owning up to their score, perhaps. Okay, who got less than 6? What was yours, Matt?
National Resilience and Climate Adaptation Strategy, 2 out of 16.
2 out of, okay. Anyway.
And the 2 it got were the case for policy broadly accepted and the risks of not addressing the problem.
Right, good, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, well, yep. Well, drought agreement sort of comes up a bit like that. And there's quite a number that are like that. I thought Phil Gibbons or someone might pick biodiversity strategy, for example. This is my ranking. A friend of mine, he might be online, but I didn't look at it, but the towards sustainability, achieving cleaner production strategy, which doesn't exist, I don't think. Beautiful piece of work. And I've got page lengths there. That's not to say more pages is good strategy, but sort of, you know, the top of the list is what I think are the good strategies and the bottom is what I think are the bad ones. It's not meant to be a scoring thing, but I thought it'd be a good thing to end up on. I've gone a little bit over time, but I'll leave it at that. That's a helicopter view of 4 papers. Thank you. Shall I hover for a bit?
Yeah, so do we have any clarification questions on that? I'm disagreeing. I think the land care policy actually was a half-page press release from Bob Hall. Yeah. So we can call that a strategy. But any questions of clarification for Nadeem before we head on into Jim's presentation? Nadeem seems happy, but do try and store up, if you like, deeper questions, because we do want to have a bit of a discussion after both presentations. Now we're just pulling your presentation up. Bear with us.
Yep. Just gonna, yeah, just bring up the slideshow there. There we go, and you can go through that. Oh, that's still the last time. There we go.
Okay. Jim, I think to advance, it's just...
Yeah, just to go back and forward like that.
Okay, good. Thank you for coming. I'm aiming just to provide an overview of my research, the approaches I've used, and I guess my tentative sort of conclusions. So the Murray-Darling Basin planning process is sort of widely regarded as a policy disaster. John Quiggin, for example, characterised the early phases as being one of the most disastrously misconceived and mismanaged policy processes in Australian history. I guess my question is, why is this so and how has it come to be? And this type of failure is often put down to a lack of political will or leadership, not something that's sort of intrinsic to the problems themselves or to governance problems. That is, we tend to think we know what sustainability is, what needs to be done, and either policies for it, we just don't do it. On the other hand, ecology is seen as being a very complex issue and something difficult for public policy inherently to handle. And so I think this is an inherent sort of paradox. So my research question is really, how do you explain environmental and sustainability policy? And I think this requires consideration of the intersection of 2 complex and evolving things. One is about how we think about doing public policy itself as a broad issue, and the other is how we think about the environment and a human relation to that, and how we think about sustainability as a result. in doing this work, I take on board Kate Crowley's injunction that explanations of policy cannot be made sense of without considering the broader political and institutional context. I take water reform in the basin with a focus on the basin plan itself as my case study. In particular, I focus on the development of the notorious guide and the subsequent events that led to the basin plan, and I guess immediately after that is the time period that I'm sort of focused on. So the goal of the basin plan was to place environmentally sustainable limits on the amount of water that could be taken from the basin's rivers for consumptive use. The guide was prepared as the first step in this process of developing the plan, ostensibly to present the proposals to the community for discussion. Now, today is actually one day after 10 years since this happened, but there were very heated protests about the guide. They culminated in its burning less than a week after the guide had come out, and this was in Griffith. The conflict was front page news for weeks and politically controversial for a long time after that. In fact, it still is. But is widely regarded as a policy fiasco. Now, reasons for thinking about it as a disaster, at this phase of it at least, are usually attributed to two things. There's been a lack of consultation with stakeholders and affected communities, and with the water reform propositions poorly communicated, developed in secrecy in a black box. And the other one being that social and economic factors weren't adequately taken into account in determining the proposal. And that's concomitant with the fact that, well, it goes with the notion that, in fact, no socioeconomic analysis was done at all, is the story. So the implication was that if only they'd done X or Y, then it would all have worked out okay. The disaster need not have happened and should not have happened. No responsible or competent government would have brought forward such a policy plan. What I'm not saying there's no empirical substance to each of these claims. I'll come back to these. I suggest these rationales are simplistic and naive, and that the explanation runs a lot deeper into political and ontological areas. So I draw on Mark Boven's and Paul DeHart's study of policy fiascos, and they want us to be aware of, quote, the limited validity of deterministic and monocausal explanations of the evolution of policy episodes. They caution us to pay heed to the political dimension of policy making and evaluation, and discussions around policy failure are usually infused with questions about value judgments, and there's political advantage to be had in construing the phenomena this way. Now, Now I find that a wicked problem framing assists in illuminating the paradoxes and conundrums we observe in development of the basin plan and water reform. My first paper addressed this idea, and central to Ritwell and Webber's thesis of nearly 50 years ago now is the proposition, the formulation of a wicked problem is the problem. The main insights I gleaned from their paper concern what I call the postmodern point. That is, there's Western societies fragmenting in the sense of having shared values and interests, such that universalist notions of progress that we used to believe in are increasingly contested. Science and expertise is increasingly treated with skepticism as well. And the second point is an ecological point, that everything is connected, interdependent, not in the sense of plants and animals, but in the sense of how events and things happen. So there's lots of repercussions, side effects from any decision that's taken. As a result, as Ritwell and Webber said, wicked problems can be considered a symptom of another problem. And then the third one, which sort of brings those together, is what I call the ontological point. That is, because of the very nature of such problems, with their uncertainty over knowledge and the ambiguity over values and goals, that makes them intractable to resolution through rational technocratic analysis. I'll provide an example to ground your thinking. So Mark Hampstead reports about a report they did for water planning for the NWC, the Water Commission, that up until the early 1990s, water planning was really aimed around meeting water supply for human needs for agriculture and consumption. It then shifted focus to resource-based planning, with the objective being sustainable use of water in terms of both human uses and the health of ecological systems. The construction of dams and irrigated infrastructure to meet supply is a relatively tame problem. So down the bottom left corner, if you like, of the diagram. With the maturing of the water economy, which economists like Randall and Watson reported on in the early 1980s, where water resources were more or less fully allocated, meaning that any further allocations would reduce reliability for all users. And also with the simultaneous increase in concern about environmental degradation, you can see both the emergence of the wicked problem compared to the earlier tame one, and how that this is a consequence, in effect, of fixing the tame problem. So the critical question becomes, knowing this about wicked problems for nearly 50 years, and the post-positivist policy field is full of this as well, why is it that we keep seeking to resolve complex problems by applying forms of technical rationality? Why would a government request an agency to use best available scientific knowledge and socioeconomic analysis to resolve a problem like water allocation in the MDB? Essentially, essentially the reason why is policymakers must be seen to act authoritatively in response to problems that arise on the political agenda. There is a paradox, as Hal Colbert observes. Fundamental to the idea of policy is the assumption of instrumentality. Policy is to be understood in terms of objectives and the way to achieve them. It is oriented around problems and problem solving. Now, this is a culturally deep-seated sort of idea that goes back to the Enlightenment and ideas of rationality and profound ideas of progress, and that we can apply reason to make that progress. And as anyone in the public policy business knows, as Nadeem's pointed out, the principles of good practice policy making are first and foremost that the problems should be well defined and acknowledged at the outset, and the objectives should be clearly specified and outcome oriented. This is the way that success lies. The question then becomes, how do such ill-structured problems or wicked problems become tame? How do they become rendered technical? Because they must in some form. So briefly, my approach is a discursive analytical approach. It's Foucauldian inspired. I have a few Foucault books. I can't say read them, they're hard to read. But there is so much literature that is based on his work. And I guess the key points here are the constructivist ontology and the post-positivist epistemology, which is about contrasting it with the scientific method, if you like, and that human meaning is a critical part of understanding what goes on. There's a Foucauldian notion that discourse, as systems of ideas and practices, construct truths, social truths and political truth claims about objects, subjects and social realities. Reality is constructed through processes of social meaning making, including through language. I'm only using Martin Hayer's definition of discourse, which is one of the broader definitions, which includes, goes into social practices as well as, it's not just linguistics or language. And I'll keep going on from there. Hoping people have read that for themselves. But it's a way that discourse relates to what happens in the real world. And, oh, sorry, I'll leave it there. But this sort of approach broadly falls within the hermeneutic philosophical tradition, in that there is not a material or real empirical world out there. It's not that that's not the case, or that facts don't matter. It's more a question of what one makes of the facts. As John Caputo puts it, objectivity is redescribed, not discarded. It's understood in a more cautious and circumspect way. So back to exploring this question of problem formulation, which is really my focus in the sense in relation to the basin plan and the guide experience. I applied two approaches, the first of which was Carol Bucky's "What's the problem represented to be" approach, which is essentially about examining and critiquing how problems are produced in practical texts, like a Water Act or a policy statement. I've reflected on the problematizations in the Water Act and how they manifested themselves in the guide to the proposed basin plan. What I found was apparent lack of water was problematized in a very narrow way. It was about how much water had to go back to the environment and not, for example, about structural adjustment, community viability or change, or considering alternate strategies for meeting the environmental objectives even. One of the consequences of this environmental water problematization is that for irrigators, it fails to do much to address the question of over-allocation, ostensibly what we're addressing in the first place, in terms of their water resource security. Water has in effect been reallocated, not over-allocation and reduced. My third paper, and the second approach in terms of discourse analysis, is based on Martin Hayer's work, is argumentative discourse analysis. And I use this to illuminate how environmental water problem was understood and represented by different interest groups, so-called discourse coalitions in his terms, in the basin, and how the conflict played out discursively. So key to Hayer's work is that he argues that there can be places and moments where certain perceptions of what constitutes the policy problem emerge, change, or are reproduced and start to shape what happens in environmental politics. You can think of John Howard's intervention in the first place with the National Plan for Water Security as one of these in response to the drought. The fish kills is one that comes up later. The social conflict that erupted over the guide just days after its release, I argue is a pivotal one in this case, perhaps best summed up by this quote in the Sydney Morning Herald article at the time. The problem is no longer that an entire river basin is dying, the problem has suddenly become the government's plan to revive it. So the discursive battle was between what I label the environment first position and the optimisation or balance position. They're akin to the concepts of strong and weak sustainability found in the sustainability literature. Briefly, the environment first storyline was that the river was dying and needed to be saved for the wider public good. This has its origins in the ecological life support systems notion that without a healthy environment, there cannot be healthy communities or sustainable production. The optimisation version represents the popular triple bottom line view of sustainability. In short, the optimisation position became dominant in its establishing a social truth. The water reallocation propositions contained in the guide were rejected by many on the basis that they were neither rational nor fair in both process and outcome, and hence illegitimate. Now, to briefly exemplify what I'm suggesting about discursive constructions, I'll return briefly to the two main reasons given for the disaster earlier on. Each of these reasons advanced a lack of, that is, a lack of consultation and poor communication on the one hand, and not taking account of socioeconomic on the other. By providing a narrative of what occurred, effectively establishes the social truth, that is, a fact of the situation, that becomes widely understood and accepted as apparently incontrovertible. Now, I guess the key point here is that they are contestable as propositions. Alternate interpretations not only are possible, but exist. That is, there's no objective truth of the matter, only judgment. To make the claim that social and economic factors had not been taken into account, for example, this claim has its origin in several places. Most notably in the public domain, it starts with the comments of the chair of the MDBA himself, Mike Taylor, at the media launch. His comments were issued in an apologetic tone, suggesting that his hands were tied because of the Environment First prescriptions in the Water Act, and that the MDBA was merely doing what the Parliament had stipulated. The inference was, had this not been the case, the proposed water diversion limits might well have looked different. These comments became more frequent and strident in the regional meetings that followed the launch. He left a clear impression that the MDBA had not been able to take adequate account of social and economic factors. This was the very same storyline that the irrigator and farmer groups had been lobbying the government about since the passage of the Water Act some years earlier, but that did not make the news at the time. And they prosecuted the claim relentlessly in the media, including through stories of tragedies that would befall families, farmers and communities if these cuts came true once the guide came out. These claims were subsequently validated at the height of the immediate controversy in Griffith, where the guide was burnt by two acts. Firstly, the MDBA itself, that very night or the next day, announced, "We've heard loud and clear the call by regional communities across the basin for further updated research into the local community effects of the proposed basin plan." And secondly, the Australian government declared it was establishing an independent parliamentary inquiry, the Windsor Inquiry, into the impact of the guide on regional communities, with a strong focus on understanding the human impact of proposed changes, implying they hadn't been taken into account. So if the government itself acknowledged the claim, it must have been true, a fact. Key to the power of this claim was that if it was true, then the government and faceless bureaucrats in Canberra had acted neither fairly nor rationally. It wasn't rational because the proposal quite clearly betrayed the optimisation principles of ESD, the triple bottom line, and as stated as an objective in the Water Act. It wasn't fair because the impacts on people had not been taken into account, one set of values being privileged over others, and they had not even been consulted about it. In fact, the fellow at the Griffith meeting had the sign around him saying about how come frogs are more important than people. And Barnaby Joyce repeated this ad nauseum in a way. Interestingly, the MDBA itself did not engage in this debate in that way. It saw itself as being independent presenter of the science and put forward the options demanded of it in the Water Act. Now, the counter-narrative, very briefly, was that it's clear from the guide document itself that socioeconomic analysis had been undertaken and had been taken into account in formulating the three options that were put forward. They were the reasons the three options were put forward. It may well not have been, or were constrained in that way. It may well not have been well communicated or reported upon by the media, but informed commentators pointed this out, not to much avail given the political ruckus that was taking place and the focus on the human impact news story. Not long afterwards, the chair of the MDBA and then the chief executive resigned, and the guide was placed in the archive as a new, more balanced and deliberative approach was adopted. This was a new narrative. So I'm not seeking to make any judgment on the validity or otherwise of the substantive arguments here, merely to point out that discursive constructions and the way in which they occur can have powerful effects. Beyond this, I suggest the nub of the conflict, and this is where I go really, harks back many years to the two competing unresolved conceptualizations of what ESD, Ecologically Sustainable Development, means, or should mean, and how social and economic factors and environmental factors should be considered in determining it. So in my fourth paper, How Does an Environmental Policy Mean? I sought to place this discursive analysis that I've been doing into the broader context of the sustainability challenge. It dealt with the emergence and ideational contestation of environmental policy and the ESD concept in Australia, and located it in its wider institutional and political setting, including from the perspective of environmental political theory. So what do I make of all of this? And the research I've done and the contemplating since doing these papers. And I'm still trying to really weave these threads together into my, I guess, my final argument, but here are my tentative thoughts. First and overarchingly, I agree with Martin Hayes' conclusion in his The Politics of Environmental Discourse of 25 years ago now, that the environmental conflict has become discursive. It no longer focuses on the question of whether there is an environmental crisis. It is essentially about its interpretation. I found that you can't make sense of environmental and sustainability policy without taking account of two key factors. The first is that it's politics all the way up or all the way down, if you want to look at that way, or what I, after Deborah Stone, I think of as policy politics. The second is that the respective economic and ecological conceptualizations of ESD are ontologically irreconcilable, only resolvable politically. Yet integrating these in decision-making is said to be, and is, the crux of ESD. Related to this, despite the advent of ESD, nothing has really changed institutionally about how we think about doing public policy, how we should conceptualize what it is, and how it should be done. That is, our mentalities or rationalities of governing, that's another Foucauldian idea, that shape these ideas remain dominated by an economic rationalism. Or as Deborah Stone puts it, the field of policy analysis is dominated by economics and its model of society as a market. Indeed, I think it can be argued, as is more widely the case, there's been a growing neoliberal economistic colonisation of societal values, including ecological values, that have been in progress for decades now. On my first assertion or narrative about the politics, I argue that the most critical cause of the Basin Plan disaster was bound up in John Howard's political electoral ambitions, together with Kevin Rudd's Me Tooism desire at the time to minimise differences between the two, except where he chose to demarcate specific differences like on climate change. As Neil Byron and a few others have suggested, the guide is just a product of the MDBA, which is a product of the Water Act. Do I need to? Which in turn is a product of the hastily produced 2007 National Plan for Water Security. So with an election looming and with a perfect storm of climate change, drought and water shortages occurring, Howard was desperate to avoid being seen as yesterday's man out of touch with public opinion. As he said himself, he needed to respond to the idea of doing something about the environment. A man of action presented fresh ideas for the future. As a strong leader, which political scientists characterize him as, he was seen to thrive on divisiveness, and the key strategy was to attack the states in a range of policy areas. And if you think about it, his switch on the NWI is a deal with the states done just a couple of years before, which he then reneges on more or less. On water, it was easy to portray the Labor states, Labor, as incompetent, reckless, on over-allocation and standing in the way of the national interest. As in several other areas, health, education, Indigenous intervention, the answer was Commonwealth intervention to solve problems. And if you go all the way back up my tree to the ESD, it was essentially driven as a political strategy designed to address increasingly divisive conflicts, one of which is water, mining, and in particular forestry at the time, it was a very big one, over the use of natural resources and the environment. By virtue of facilitating a political consensus, the goal remains vague and it contains conflicting economic and ecological objectives they are not clear, hence don't conform to the stipulations of good policy principles. Once again, as Deborah Stone observes more broadly, not even about sustainability, it's a motherhood issue, motherhood goal. Everyone is for them when they are stated abstractly, biodiversity strategy, but the fight begins as soon as we ask what people mean by them. What are you going to do about them? In effect, it's not a policy solution, but a restatement of the policy problem. And this occurs again and again, all the way down to the Water Act and the Basin Plan. As Dan Connell reported in relation to the NWI, the National Water Initiative, it was simply a new episode in an old story, not a settled policy. Mark Hampstead too, in reviewing that regional water planning, points out water planners and policymakers don't know what it is to implement ESD. On my second factor regarding ontology, we are caught between the reality and centrality of human embeddedness within the natural world, our interdependence with ecological processes and life support systems, and the reality that we are individuals and social beings who must act instrumentally, both in policy and each of our everyday lives, feeding, clothing, and housing ourselves. These concerns are central to environmental political theorists. And there's a desire to see ecological considerations move from beyond an issue area on the periphery to the centre of governing public policy and decision making. How do you rate my time? A couple more? Okay. If we accept the need for this to occur, a radical shift in political philosophy is probably required, one that poses major challenges to current dominant beliefs to do with liberalism, freedom, private property, the market economy, and so on. However, a major challenge here is to be able to move from an ontological and ecological consciousness raising to placing it in a political philosophical context, to set out a political, social and economic agenda that can actually be operationalised. This seems pretty unlikely. For example, Norgard, a very eminent ecological economist, I think in his eminent days, sets out what he calls a manifesto, for a great transition, a call, with calls for a change in belief systems and institutions, all very erudite at that level. But when you get to the program of action, it dissipates. So I guess in part, I argue that we still don't really know what we're really doing when it comes to the environment or what sustainability is, or more particularly, how it makes sense. What is an ecological rationality, a reasoning process that might inform this? We can only know this by looking in the rearview mirror, what was, because we know we've been there, we've been in a safe space. But as we move from the Holocene into the Anthropocene, our moorings have become a bit loosened. So to conclude, I conclude that environmental and sustainability policy making is and will remain for the foreseeable future in a funk. The funk can be seen as having its roots in postmodern dilemma that I've just outlined. Indeed, it can be thought of as a grand funk. That was my 70s pun. Grand Funk Railroad, for those who know. Or a double funk. That is, the wicked problem that besets public policy analysis more generally as an activity and as a field of study. Despite decades of research to identify better methods and processes, no one has really nailed such a thing. And the other part of the funk, the ontological funk that besets how we think about the relationship of humans to nature and how that affects how we think about public policy. So I think we're left, as many political scientists often conclude, with Robert Hopp, who's a post-positivist policy analysis too, calls the governance of problems. The acceptance of wicked problems that won't just be fixed once and for all by rendering them technical, as John Howard promised us with the Basin Plan, the inevitability of politics in discursively constructing our narratives and playing a central role in major questions of resource allocation. And as I quote Deborah Stone again, she's one of my favourites as a political scientist, once again, she says, problems in the polis, in the political field, are never solved in the way that economic needs are met in the market model. We can't just place an order for justice or equity or sustainability and get the order filled as you always hear, get the job done. Or back to Riddle and Webber's own conclusion in Wicked Problems, that ill-defined policy problems rely upon elusive political judgment for resolution and resolving over and over again. It's a political program. So I'm finished, and I guess my thank yous are at the end, particularly to Steve, a very patient supervisor. Neil is giving very pointed comments to me at times have been very useful. Dan earlier on, as Nadeem said, the Jaded Diamonds, and especially Nadeem for his social lubrication of making those things actually happen. Kirsten Henderson, in some ways my muse, but also a good checker of my silly ideas, and many others who've given advice and feedback, and Fender School admin folk for putting up with my routinely late reports and what have you. So thank you.
Okay, I think what's going to happen is that in a bout of technical brilliance, Pete will come over and we'll transfer so we can see chat and questions here and then be able to bounce between us here in the real world and you other people out there somewhere. We have seen your names. There were 22 of you when I last looked. So if it's time to get up and have a quick 2-minute break, this might be the time to do it. Welcome back, everyone. I should like turn the camera around so you see there really are real people here, several. So we actually had one question there from, is that all you've written, Peter? Hi, PK. High scores are history, Nadeem. Now we have National Cabinet, ... There is a question in there whether National Cabinet would make any difference to what COAG did, but that's possibly another one. Comments in the room or on chat from outside the room, please do them. Oh, well, we do have some chat there which you can respond to. No, that's an invitation to go for a beer with Peter Panofsky, which is probably great.
There is a fellow garden pop-up.
Okay. Two bits of news. There is a University House pop-up bar, we've just been told. And I've been advised by Jim that it is 10 years and 1 day today from the burning of the guide, which means it's actually the 10-year anniversary of It's All Off and We'll Try Again. So good timing. Stuart. Hang on. Oh, hang on. So people online can hear. We will use a COVID-safe microphone system, which you're not allowed to touch, Stuart.
My question is going to be, should we abandon or adapt policy cycle? When I did my scoring, it didn't score very highly, but I also didn't score very highly in school reports. And I used to think some of the criteria, like having your shirt tucked in, weren't important criteria. Could the gap between what we score and your expectations of policy that are captured in the questions be the problem?
Nadeem?
Thanks, Steve. I don't know if I fully understood your question, but let me answer what I think you're asking. So firstly, policy cycle, it's just an analytical heuristic. And I was trying to say that I've found it really beneficial. It's a useful mechanism to drill into policy processes. That's point one. Point two, it's not really meant to, my framework isn't meant to be a scoring framework. That was just me trying to make it a bit of an interactive exercise. But in a sense, what I'm saying is that the 60 criteria that are in there are my third paper, which isn't published yet, but I hope it will be. I'm basically saying those 60 criteria are all essential criteria for good practice. So in a sense, the policy cycle and the framework, I was trying to say, if you want good policy processes, these things are must considers when you're doing a strategy. So there's an element of me sort of saying the framework I've developed, and when I say I, there's been lots of input, including the expert panel, thanks to the expert panel, who I think some of them might be in the audience anonymously. You can either use the framework as a how-to guide. So if there was going to be a new strategy on X, I think it could be like a menu of how to do these things. I've really done it as an evaluative tool. So if anyone wanted to review the NWI or the Regional Forest Policy Statement or land care or any other strategy that is in existence, this provides a mechanism as a policy evaluative tool. Now, does that answer where you were getting it? Thanks.
Actually, I'm going to add to that. Many policy cycle or policy process models start with this magic thing called issue identification or problem identification, which I think goes to Jim's argument of that, oh, it just pops up, perfectly formed and assumedly answerable, which is possibly, and I won't point to an alternative model published by certain people, which is actually there's a lot we should think about before that happens. But now I'm going to try and, says there are new messages. No, that's someone having, hello Awadesh, having problems with signs, or do I go up there? Now, there's a Q&A. No, that's still just showing me Peter's one. We're not very good at this, by the way. So from within the room, I do have a National Water Initiative scored at 11 out of 16 there from Tony. Karina.
I think my question's mainly for Jim, but I think also probably for Nadeem as well. Thank you both. They were really great seminars. It's about trade-offs, because I think you sort of put forward quite a convincing argument that we never reconciled the trade-offs inherent in the definition of ESD, and so therefore they play out and into the current politics. And then when we think with a future orientation, those trade-offs are only going to get harder as we have more people, we have more urbanisation, we need to create more food, we have less water, we have hotter, you know, the great acceleration kind of narrative. So is part of this kind of new political orientation that we need to find about becoming better at dealing with those trade-offs? And if so, what might that, like, what's a political discourse that could be acceptable? Because, you know, the win-win thing is so much easier to sell than the win-lose thing. So I don't really, yeah.
Jim is coming forward on that one.
What's the best articulated question?
Yeah,
but you know
no, it's a very good question though, and I guess it's the guts of the issue. Well, I think, you know, part of it is that you know, when the win-win, and you're right, but people put that forward, and win-lose. But it's partly, what was I going to say? That the way into that, if you think about this, the water management thing, I guess as per that quote from Sydney Morning Herald, and then Asa Walquist has a very nice sort of bit in a piece she wrote, is that it sort of gets lost that this is that ontological connection, if you like. It gets lost that we actually have this dependence on this healthy system to do these other things. And I guess that's where I'm really trying to come at. It's not that, you know, there will always be trade-offs, but to the dominant way we have of looking at it is it's sort of only about trade-offs and a cost-benefit analysis, you know, weighing up this side and weighing up that side, and we all based on our aggregating our individual preferences and whatever. And then we come to the answer, and you go, that doesn't really work when to deal with this sort of more fundamental ecological demand we have. I guess that's sort of more where I was trying to come from. I guess I'm also saying that dealing with trade-offs in the future, no, it just isn't going to be easy, but it will always be political. And I guess picking up Steve's thing before about, you know, what problems just emerged, well, they emerge politically. you know, we've got all this discussion at the moment about EPBC Act and what, you know, the devolving to the states and all of this stuff. And you think about, well, water isn't even on that list of national priorities. It didn't get picked up and dealt with by Howard in government because it was listed as a Commonwealth issue. It got picked up because it was political in his interest to run with it, to deal with a real issue. But the question is, how does he deal with the real issue? And, you know, what are the strategies? You know, as someone else reports, didn't really go and even talk about it with the MDBC, who's been managing this interrelationship with the states for a long time. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay, we have another question from in the room.
Hi, Tim Fisher. This is part question, part observation to you, Jim, because you know, having been involved in water and the basin off and on for some 30 years, I guess, I can't help but think that there has been enormous change in that time frame, and including that through the 90s under the 94 policy, the states did make half-hearted, ham-fisted attempts to resolve things in a more consultative way, and got, well, next to nowhere really. And I think it's possible to look at the basin plan as both through the lens that, yes, in some respects it has been a policy disaster, but in other respects it's been remarkably successful and enduring in achieving its outcomes. And I actually suspect, Nadeem, against your criteria, it wouldn't stack up all that badly. So I kind of think of it as a deeply flawed masterpiece. It's done a hell of a lot, right. And what's done is now going to be very hard to undo. And also, you had Griffith up there on the screen a couple of times. There was an independent study done, economic analysis of the impacts, short to long-term impacts of the basin plan on Griffith, and it came up positive that the net benefits to the Griffith community.
But that's what all the analysis said up front, that there wasn't going to be these big impacts, especially for the bigger communities. That doesn't say that there aren't negative impacts for lots of communities. There are, and they're real. But if I just pick up your first point.
Invariably, they're communities that were on the way out anyway.
Yeah.
It's really hard to unscramble that.
And but what's interesting is the way, you know, this used to be said, you know, you put up something that people, you put up and people come running to it. You know, we got on with buybacks. You didn't go out and have all of this consultation and all this stuff before that. So, and the success in some ways that you talked about has come from that. But I also pick up your point about, and I agree with you, because what I'm trying to say is that there's these ways into truths, looking at it, in that this criticism about, that's another example, but time I couldn't go into, about consultation, because that's put forward, and there's a legitimacy to that argument. But on the other hand, as you say, the reason, part of Howard's reason for putting forward is like, and the text is there since the 94 agreement, the COAG agreement, that real progress wasn't made, and for the very same reasons that it's proved difficult for the guide and the basin plan. But each time to back away, and so you go, well, here is what I think Bridgman and Webber called for, you know, the political, and you think the political imprimatur, you think after 20 years of discussion and everyone agreeing this needs to be done, but no one being able to do it, that you do have that you don't have to go out and consult at that level about all of that again. But you know, a lot of the players involved or concerned, and this is where the discourse of construction works in politically again, something gets whipped up there, construed a certain way, like this, you know, and this is, we can construe it as poor communication, or you can construe it as also deliberate communication from irrigators and farmer groups, for example, about cuts, or about, you know, you're not already saying, I think Neil pointed this out in one of his pieces, that a whole lot of this water is already being got, as if that didn't have impacts. But anyway, so yeah, there are these different ways. That's why, you know, when often it's put forward that the next step in all of this is a bit more argumentation, deliberation as a prescriptive, as a way to go about it. But there's all sorts of issues there, partly because it also comes back to the question of how does a problem arise politically? And it isn't as if when it arises politically, people have agendas, people have interests. They're not just sort of neutral or do it all for the good of everybody. So I guess that's what I'm trying to bring out. So I think I agree with you. And it is whatever you call it.
We've got a question here from Joe online, which I think I'll direct to Nadeem in the first instance on adaptability as part of the policy success, given that conditions change. You'll probably know exactly which number criteria is that, but a comment on that, Nadeem.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought that would come to me, Steve, when I saw it up there. Yeah, thanks, Joe, and hi, thanks for joining in this room, Joe. I think that's what I was trying to say with the policy cycle, which I put up, sort of saying what's wrong with how these policies are implemented. So there's a political decision which Jim has gone into, and then the bureaucracy takes over and has to try and put flesh on the bones of, the who, why, what, where, when. Now, usually that's not done well. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying that I personally do believe the selection of objectives is quite important. So if you go to Karina's question about win-win, that was the utopia of ESD. You could have a win-win-win. I really liked it. Who would not want a win-win? It's better than a win-lose, right? But the reality is there's winners and losers. And I think when you start, so I'm coming to your question, Joe, that when you're starting to set, at least for the strategies I've looked at, what are these strategies about? You do have to identify what is it you're really trying to do in some level of measurable detail. Because if you don't, and this is what, if you look at what's happened in the past for the policies I've looked at, NWI, forest, land care, by not being clear about what are you trying to do, an evaluation almost always says you're failing. And so that was my point about, the adaptive management, and Matt Colliff's the whiz on this, but adaptive management theory sort of says you have your theories, your assumptions, you implement them, and then you evaluate to see what happened and what didn't work, and then you go back and change your theories, assumptions on the basis of that. Am I broadly correct, Matt? Yes, something along those lines you're saying. So what happens with these strategies in terms of adaptation and success or failure is that we don't really know what success looks like, and it's really hard. Jim's sort of gone into some of that. Because we're not explicit about success, the evaluation after 5 years will inevitably say the policy has failed. Almost all of them say the policy's failed. That's partly also to do about whether we have the right data to do the analysis. Usually it's not. We sort of retrofit the data to the question. But that's in my framework, but perhaps for another time. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is let's be a little bit clearer about what these strategies are trying to do. Let's be clear about the types of outcomes we think we want to get, so that when we do an evaluation and the adaptation is to come in, it's not based on, oh, that failed. That's why I said, it's usually sort of seen as that was a Labour Party policy or that was a Liberal Party policy. They don't know how to do it. We'll fix it with, instead of taking the right fork, we'll take the left fork on this strategy. We've seen that in MDB reforms around water buybacks versus infrastructure money, if that makes sense for people who've been in that space. So yeah, I'll look at a bit of a ramble, Joe, but just trying to say that I think clarity of aims, objectives in the strategies are important in terms of being able to know where the adaptation points should be and are going to be.
We've got Matt, I'll come to you to say, we've got a couple online, because if you leave early, I'll call you back, whereas they might have to log off. So we've got two questions from Michael and from Emma. One is, how much would better, more regular, etc., information assist in terms of accountability and so on? And the other is, have you considered comparison of a non-intervention case? Was there a policy failure that probably did worse than not doing anything at all? And I might get that other people could think of something that we probably would have been better off not having that strategic policy at all. But on either question, possibly the information one first, while you think of the negative policy success, or whatever we'd call it.
Hello again. Information one, I touched on it briefly, but so from the evaluation side, at least my experience is, when it comes to what information do we need to answer whether we're successful or not, I think usually we're so far, so evaluation is a bit like communication. It happens right at the end when, you know, two days before the deadline of the effectiveness report's due. I think the first MDBA effectiveness report was a bit like that. It was, you know, the question was, hey, we've got to do a report. The Act says we've got to do a report, effectiveness report. Right, what's the information we need to be able to do that? And so usually the answer is, well, what information do we have? And we'll give you the answer fitted to so the data availability fits the answer, if that makes sense. What was the second part?
The second question is the non-intervention case.
Oh, so the non-intervention case, yeah.
Asking that out to everyone.
Yes, but my quick view on that, and I've covered it in my paper, is that I've looked at national strategies, and the assumption is that we need a national strategy because the states are failing. And I think Neil's tested me on this a lot. You know, I don't know if there's always enough rigor around that assumption that the states haven't done enough, the national strategy will fix it. And, you know, I think that's, in fact, I put up this slide on research gaps. And I think one of the research questions or research interests is, well, are the states actually not doing too bad a job, really? You know, this assumption that the states, that you need a national strategy to fix the problem is perhaps questionable. Thanks.
I'll advance one possible in response to Emma's, and Neil's got one. I knew he would. I think many people would think the Northern Territory intervention may have caused as much, if not more damage than what it was meant to do. Neil, you have a...
I'm just trying to think of a situation where
we'll get a...
where the politicians announced that we're not going to have a national policy into X because we've decided we couldn't do anything about it, would make it better.
Agriculture says...
And that's why we don't have a national agriculture policy. Okay. No, because what I was going to say in a serious sense was that all of these policy statements are partly diagnosis of some issue or casting it as a problem, and that's heavily contested. There's a projection or a forecast of what might happen if this real or imagined problem remains unaddressed. And then there's a proposal for implementation and delivery of this is how we, the clever people, are going to fix this terrible situation. And that's also very contested by people who are saying, A, it won't work, or it's not worth the effort of doing all those things. And so it's not surprising that when somebody comes up with a grand policy statement into gizmos or widgets, people are both asking, is it really a serious problem? Have you defined it properly? Why is it a problem and to whom? And is your proposed remedy a real remedy or a complete waste of time, smoke and mirrors?
Yeah. Matt, a question, and I think behind that discussion about the states not doing well enough, that could be the problem is that the Commonwealth wants to do something because it feels it has to, even if it may not be a problem, or only one or two states may be actually evidencing some kind of failure to deliver, but federally you go for the whole national strategy thing. Matt?
Okay, thanks to both. Nadeem, thanks for your 16 theses, which should be nailed to the cathedral door at Alara Street. Jim, thanks for raising that issue that made me completely rethink the idea of the relationship between the Water Act and the Basin Plan in terms of the contestability of the concept of adaptation within the plan. And various CEOs of MDBA have insisted that the Basin Plan is adaptive. And I've always questioned that. And I've questioned it because of the rigid structure that the Water Act puts in place and how it constrains the plan, particularly around interpretations of the primacy of environment versus a triple bottom line approach. But when you think about the events that unfolded, you hit the nail on the head when you said, you know, Mike Taylor's apologetic view that I'm just doing what I'm told and this is what the Water Act says. The reframing came when Tony Burke said, Mike Taylor and I have a different view about the interpretation of the Water Act. The triple bottom line idea was adaptive in itself. That then led to a couple of things happening. The Windsor Report, which was what I've always thought the first and the last time that basin communities ever got consulted properly. And that's where you started to see the emergence of a different set of potential governance structures that could have occurred. And those were based on a bottom-up approach, which could have been embraced and met that top-down technocratic approach. And I wonder whether moving forward in terms of that adaptive concept starts to look like having those hard conversations about how you get genuine community engagement and genuine community solutions at the catchment and sub-catchment scale, and how we start to develop the plan from there. Because I don't agree with this narrative that it's okay to say, you know, the Basin Plan is largely achieving its objectives. That basically just doesn't look ecology, society and economics in the face and say, there are some real issues here that we need to solve. And if we don't engage the bloody communities in coming up with that stuff, how the hell are we going to move forward?
Okay, Jim, and I would note just before this answer comes that of all the significant national legislation I've had an interest in the last 30 years, the Water Act was probably the least scrutinised in Parliament because everyone was so gung-ho. Why was there an issue?
Yes, and it was, I'd argue that it's a bit like national security issues. It was less scrutinised because who wanted to stand up and say, particularly when Labor Party had already said to itself, we're not going to contest this. It's not in our political interest. It's another whole political model about policy subsystems and bigger systems. And when a subsystem game like water management is, you know, within an existing network where the technical people and even the policy people all talk with one another and sort stuff out. But then when it jumps up into this other game, the issue becomes a different game. And that's essentially what happens there, because I mean, I think Tony Windsor says he's about the only one who didn't agree. And so that, no, but what's interesting is that when you go back on that, you know, that doesn't mean that all the people sitting there understood what was going through, or that they would agree with the environment first presumption. And I think those who know about this, I guess, know enough about why it is framed that way. There's a myth in that too, though, to say even if it wasn't framed that way, if it was framed triple bottom line, that suddenly miraculously the problem would go away and we work out this optimum solution. That's a dream. And so that's a whole nother myth that gets put forward. It's just on adaptation, contestability. I think the thing with adaptive management is it's still in the end a bit like what Nadeem's been talking about is it still relies on this idea that you have this agreed purpose and goal around which you're going to adapt. And the same, as far as I'm concerned, goes with the resilience theory. It's the resilience of what, for whom. And that's a legitimate way of looking and questioning, but it doesn't mean that there are other people who don't have contesting what that whole thing's about. I guess part of my thing is, we're on a crisis of purpose in the sense of how do we work that out and agree on it. So on your engagement thing, actually I'll go to Burke first. I think you're right, that is he discursively reconstructed stuff politically. Or once again, there's two stories on that. All the evidence is, all the legal evidence, the South Australian Royal Commission tells you, well, I don't know, maybe it's libelous, I don't know, but he got a political win where the legal advice, we've never seen the legal advice that Burke quotes, but to the extent that it's been paraphrased and was put out, it said nothing different to what had already been known. And what is interesting is that Mike Taylor then took that and says, oh, I take that, now that I've got this political imprimatur and everyone seems to agree, everyone says, where does that number beginning with 2 comes from? Well, he said we can look for a number below 3,000. So it might be about a postcode, but that's a whole nother myth. But so, that's what's interesting on the Burke thing is that that goes pretty much uncontested. I mean, the lawyers come out and say these things, but the game moves on. And in some ways, it's a brilliant move from that point of view. I often think it's a bit like seeing executives in the bureaucracy. You get rewarded for managing a crisis that appears. You don't get rewarded for managing the process that didn't produce a crisis, because there isn't a crisis. So where was Burke and Wong and in the lead up to all of this? Because they said they'd handle the politics, you do the plan. And you go, and I think my own view is, I think because they thought it was all politically agreed, they can't argue on the other side because they put it forward, and that's Howard's legacy. You hear that repeatedly, Howard's legacy, this. You're besmirching that and going, so and that was back on Tim's question about the intervention. There is a whole positive side that I didn't give there to that legacy, but it's sort of like there's a both way things. On engagement, I think I think as Alistair Watson has said, politically, and it's the same advice, sort of advice that was given internally, the problem is, in terms of equity, the beneficiaries of the water reform process, despite my ontological point, politically is really urban elites and the wider Australian population, and this whole thing about basin-wide. You ask yourself now, where are they in the consultation and the process that goes on and on? They're not really there. And so how do you manage that tension, that scalar tension between that level and that, because that's in some ways what government's meant to do in this technical rational thing, go, well, this is in the bigger common interest. But when you go down to it, you go, well, there's all sorts of conflicts, upstream, downstream, farmers versus farmers. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but how do you manage this other component to it? Because as Tim was saying before, when it came down to it at the regional level and what states did, they go in, including, real attempts, well, not just attempts, made changes, lots of pushback, oh, don't do that again. And so it's sort of like, you step in. Lost my plot there.
Okay, I have a question for Nadeem. Any broad strategy needs some sort of statutory basis, but most often it's through existing legislative settings. Whereas the MDD plan actually had to fit within a previous piece of national legislation and several years later. That's actually fairly unusual. So we don't usually have a national policy or strategy and then say, and we're going to legislate it. But in this case, there was that fairly high profile and in many ways somewhat restrictive or proscriptive. So do you see there a problem or a difference in there with some, the RFA had its legal basis, but that was fine. It didn't shape, structure, parameterize the policy as much. But you can have your answer to Jim's answer to Matt's question and then answer my question.
Thanks, Steve. I'll start with Steve's question, which, yeah, I think so. NWI is the only one I know of that has some level of underpinning through legislation, through the Water Act. And I think you could argue that the Water Act, Tim might correct me or others might, the Water Act didn't come into being to give full effect to the NWI. It was sort of it was a response to an increasing level of drought. Now, the NWI is trying to deal with water writ large, not just water scarcity. So in that hierarchy that Jim showed, and I had a version of it as well, there's elements of the Water Act that are trying to give effect to the NWI, but it's not exactly an NWI legislation. I don't know if that's what you're getting at. Even RFAs, so while I've looked at RFAs, I still sort of consider them down in its, they're a subsidiary policy to what the regional forest policy statement was, which is what I've looked at. Now, you don't even hear of the regional forest policy statement anymore. National forest policy statement, sorry. You always hear RFAs are sort of the de facto strategy now. In fact, Neil could correct me on this as well, but the National Forest Policy Statement is actually a beautiful piece of document. It's got that win-win-win. Why wouldn't you sign on to these? It's got some wonderful aspirations. There was no legislation, RFAs came in, but I see them as being a step down in terms of a national strategy. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Steve, but yes, it's a rarity to have legislation, and that's probably a Commonwealth power thing too, because Commonwealth can't legislate just given its constitutional constraints on these national type of outcomes. So it then has to rely on some sub-level of powers, which is something less than what the strategy in its entirety is trying to do. So in fact, one of my other research questions up there was, how well do subordinate plans, policies, legislation align to the higher order strategy? And I think gut feeling is they don't align too well. They give effect to some subset of the strategy, but not the entire strategy. And just coming to Matt's one about consultation. So one of my criteria is how detailed consultation processes, how detailed were the consultation processes. It's a bit of a double-edged sword in my view, because the more you consult, the more you realize there's different opinions about what the solution is. And I don't necessarily think that gives you a better outcome, but I think it gives you a better strategy. And if you look at some of those early, even ESD, which had 2 years of consultation, 7 sectoral working groups, I think. That cleaner production one existed back when there was the ANZLIC and ANZARM, and there was a whole bit of Australian New Zealand, NRM committee and Australian New Zealand Environment Committee, which don't exist now. Even COAG doesn't exist. And so those multi-jurisdictional platforms for discussion dialogue have been eroded away. So what I'm trying to say, I think they're important. What they do, the more you consult, what it helps you do is understand the nature of the problem better, so that you can end up with a more nuanced strategy. By not doing consultation, and the National Food Plan, which was one I looked at, was done in a closed room by Coles, Woolworths, those types of agencies behind a shut door, you get a sectoral interest, in this case, the commercial interest from the food sector about the National Food Plan. And of course, so that was a Rudd-Gillard strategy. As soon as Abbott came in, he just dismissed it. So there was no buy-in into the strategy. It was almost seen as a Labour Party strategy as opposed to a, let's call it a people's strategy, because it wasn't that widely consulted. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, I'm reminded that a rural politician was asked about food policy and said, what's that got to do with farming? I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I won't name them. No, nothing online at the moment. And we're getting on for time. Are people? Oh, oh, there's another one. Whoop, announcement. Oh, given the trigger for much national policy is a large-scale problem, therefore some reform will be required. Does someone want to have a go at that question from Joe? Our speakers are trying to pass, Joe, pass your question off to someone in the audience. Yeah, Jim's up for it.
Like, I mean, like, sort of building on what Nadeem just said, I mean, I think, yeah, that really is the case. But I guess, how do you arrive at a more mature judgment that allows, like, we've got multiple problems in the ZRM environment field, let alone other ones. But how do you arrive at a more mature place that enables those sort of discussions, that doesn't already preempt them? And one of the values, I think, I was listening to what Nadeem said before, is that you do start to work out where, a no-go zone is. But, sometimes that's, I guess, undermining, we end up undermining ourselves because we end up with that lowest common denominator sort of problem. So I think that is a real challenge. But that, yeah, I think that's what Matt was sort of getting at too in his question before. I guess the way that I've thought about it a bit, and you see a bit in the literature, is about, okay, get into this problem structuration issue and work through, give much more time up front there rather than, there's a problem, we've got this objective, go do. It's sort of like, well, to work through, there's this sort of yin and yang, I suppose, or to and fro with that about, if you work through those processes, you start to identify more where genuine problems lie and where there's shared commitments and things like that. And so there is a lot of merit in that, but I still say at the same time that you come to there's sort of a curve on that too about how far it will go.
Oh, now, okay, Nadeem's going to get to that, and then we've got Karina and Matt, and my hopes of getting a quick coffee have just disappeared.
Sorry, Joe, if I think I might be able to answer some of your question there, because there's an element of that I've looked at. So losers, and it is, I think, what Matt was getting at too. So yes, there's winners and losers. The losers in these sustainability policies is almost, well, it's always the production sector. During development, policy design phase, you've got to give up some level of production to get an environmental outcome. So it might be constraining forest use, it might be limiting consumptive use of water, might be reducing amount of land use in the aspect of land care. So the losers are the production sector. But I think the barriers there is that the losers, because they're losing money, it's easy to count money as opposed to environmental loss, which is a bit more vague and loose. The losers have much better bargaining power as well. And you just look at the cotton industry, for example, and what happened with the guide. So they're better organized. They have access to political power, political influence. Because they have money, they can actually get to town hall meetings and so on. The number of MDBA meetings we went to, trying to engage with environmental groups, was really hard because they didn't even have money to come to town hall meetings in regional areas, for example. So I don't know if that gets to some of the impediments or barriers to reform that you're talking about, Joy, but I think the losers usually are winners because they can put their case of loss better. They're in a better bargaining position to get money from the government, and there's vast amounts of money that they get in reform. And that's essentially where the Commonwealth comes to the table on these things, right? With Commonwealth comes with money, we can buy our way to the reform. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay, my suggestion, we have the mic, Pete. Matt and Karina, you two, and then Nadeem and Jim. And in the interim, I would say it'll all be sorted out if we just followed the Constitution, which states there shall be an interstate commission to sort these things out.
Exactly.
Matt and Karina, and then Nadeem and Jim answer both or either.
Yeah, I mean, huge set of challenges around federalism, but just going back to that issue around reform processes and all the rest of it. If you move beyond simple adaptive management to something that starts to look more like kind of institutional reflexivity, where you're saying, are we the right people to do this job? What else do we need? What should we draw upon? How do we switch from consultation to genuine co-production? Well, I'm sorry, but we had mechanisms in place to do some of that stuff through community engagement and catchment management authorities. New South Wales blew that out of the water, taking out an entire tier of governance that would have been fundamental to addressing some of these issues for a whole load of ideological and political reasons. Some of that persists in Victoria, and the community engagement in those CMAs in Victoria, to my mind, is a model of how you start to move forward on this stuff. That's where you can genuinely tap into that bottom-up stuff and not waste time pissing around with community consultation. Anyone who lives and works as an irrigator in the Northern Basin is sick to death of going to bloody meetings and being told what's going to happen. That is not co-production. And yet, that opportunity to build co-production has been wasted through this dumbest approach to consultation.
Okay, with the mention of co-production, Karina.
I was going to ask a question that would take it in a slightly very different direction from what Matt had said, but also from some of the conversation. We haven't really talked much about leadership. I mean, like, individual political leaders have featured in the narratives that have been told, but I just wonder around the, you know, one of the sort of notions of good, strong leadership is someone standing up and, you know, providing a really compelling narrative as to why these really difficult reforms need to happen. And we've really lost that. But then the other model of leadership is a more collaborative one that's about, like, leading from behind and bringing people along in the journey. But bringing people along in the journey gets you into sort of, I guess, the community consultation quagmire that Matt has outlined. So in the absence, because, you know, the political class right now is really, really, really depressing. In the absence of leadership from there, where do we look for leadership to help move these kinds of reforms forward?
Okay, Jim, Nadeem, variously on both of those questions, and I think that'll be when we close it after you've solved that problem. Yeah.
Well, I guess more on the leadership thing. I mean, I agree with your observation, but I guess that's why I wince a little bit when people say, oh, there's just a lack of political will and whatever. You go, I don't know, if Barnaby doesn't have political will, or Barilaro, they know where their return is, and they're doing that. So it's just not necessarily in agreement with what others might say, or what others more objectively might think is the bigger interest. So, you know, when you lose your regional seats out in Western New South Wales, I think you sort of get an idea of that, and this is only one issue, but you know what's going on. So to me, like, the political will thing is like, yeah, that's true, but it also presumes we know what the right thing to do always is. And if you argue that that only comes out of consultation or democracy, that's a sort of fuzzy area too, because it doesn't, you know, I guess part of my postmodern, the wicked problem thing in the end is, you know, when it comes down to it, we don't really know. We're going with our best guess. So I think where I'm trying to head at the end of my whole thesis really is about that political challenge, though. To me, that if you do really want a good shift, you're really going to have some leaders who come along who are not so much tied into compromise every step of the way to remain in the game in the short term, to be able to set out some longer term journey. Because I just don't hear really, I mean, the Greens try to do it, to articulate an ecologically rational sort of view. But to me, that is the big challenge, and to be able to get that across. So this is like, you know, I think Matt raised them, I think it was Matt anyway, the Mike Taylor thing about the apologetic. A contrary approach to that was, this may well be what the legislation says and, you know, what it's prescribes, but this is why this might make sense in the you know, the bigger scheme of thing, and to lead in that sense. No, I don't think he believes so in it, and I think in that sense, if you reflect on the bigger political space, it wasn't wrong. And that's, I think, because the broader community isn't there beyond the motherhood sort of level about, you know, we care. So things, when the fish kills come along, suddenly everyone's outraged. And I go, well, seems like chalk and cheese. There's great irony about the burning books and the fish kills, because they're driven by different outrage imperatives. And you go, and then there's a whole scientific inquiries, contested knowledge about that. And you go, these two things don't really go together. There's some, you know, big paradox in that. No one says, oh, that's almost what we should expect from a successful implementation of a plan. You go, oh, of course it's not. We don't want that to happen. But the trade-off, you go, that's real. And every time we come to it, so the whole bit about the water market, same deal. You know, it's all good and light until, oh, no, we've got these sort of problems. But no, like, oh, no, there's some good stuff. We don't really want to change it enough. Anyway.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a 30-second answer to that one, Karina. And so in my framework, one of the questions is there strong policy agency, which is really about, you know, do politicians back this? And both, by that I mean, in this case, Labour Liberal, because we still really have a two-party system to date. And so, you know, if as soon as you badge something a Labour Party strategy or a Liberal Party strategy, and that's what the food plan was, that's what Australia in the 18th century was, as soon as Abbott came in, he got rid of them. They were actually said, you know, this is the Labour Party strategy. So I think policy agency is critical if you want long-term support on them. And the other agency has to be between state and feds. Because, you know, so if you might have federal Labour, Liberal right behind it, but if you don't have states behind it as well, so if there's no policy champions at the state level, MDB reforms are probably a classic, you know. We'll come in, the feds will come in, we'll fix it. And the state said, all right, it's your baby, you fix it, you know. So that policy agency at the state level is really important as well.
And sometimes it's contrast those two models. On the line is essentially not a community. And incomes are a one-off from the Commonwealth, which dishonours the very basis of the agreement already reached. You know, at a fundamental level, even if, oh no, we're just implementing, but you go, but you're not. That's not how the game was set up to implement. You're changing the rules of those games.
Okay, with that, I'm going to call time before we start having an argument here in the Fenner Seminar Room. Could I, a few thank yous to Jim and Nadeem for their presentations. To everyone who's turned up in person and online, and also to Pete and Steve for helping us with setup and tech today. And,